welcome. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. This is an international session for an international topic. So my name's Alan Packwood, and I'm the director of the Churchill Archive Centre here at Churchill College in Cambridge. And welcome to the latest in our occasional series of discussions with former Archives ByFellows. Today we have a highly topical and emotive subject because we're going to be talking to Kishan Rana about his book on Churchill and India, Manipulation or Betrayal, which has just been published by Routledge. The Honourable Kishan S. Rana is a former Indian ambassador. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1960, and he served for 35 years in China, in Geneva and Delhi, and then as ambassador or high commissioner to Algeria, Czechoslovakia, Kenya. He was consul general in San Francisco, high commissioner to Mauritius, and ambassador to Germany. He was then a joint secretary in Indira Gandhi's office and headed the personnel administration in the Ministry of External Affairs. More recently, he's focused on teaching and writing, which of course has led him to his book on Churchill. And I'm also owe Kishan a huge personal debt because he has written a chapter on Churchill and India for the Cambridge Companion to Winston Churchill, which is a volume that I'm currently editing and which is due out next year. Now, Kishan is currently traveling. He's going to join us today from Istanbul. I think once the diplomat, always the diplomat. And he's going to be joining us for the live Q&A. But I caught up with him while he was still in India a few days ago, and we pre-recorded our discussion. So I'm going to play that in just a second. As you listen, please feel free to post your questions in the Zoom Q&A function as they occur to you, and then we'll come to them in the live Q&A at the end. But without further ado, let's start with my conversation of a few days ago with Kishan. Congratulations on the publication of your book, Churchill and India, Manipulation or Betrayal, and thank you for taking the time for this discussion this afternoon. A huge amount has obviously been written about Winston Churchill. His official biography runs to 8 volumes with 23 companion volumes of documents. There have been huge biographies, as you know, by William Manchester, Roy Jenkins, and Andrew Roberts, to name but a few. And of course, there have been specific books that have looked at Churchill's relationship with Gandhi and on the Bengal famine. So I thought perhaps you could start by briefly summarizing what led you to this subject and to explain why you felt a different approach was needed.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's a great honor to be invited by Churchill Archives, and I appreciate all the support that you and your colleagues at the archives have given me over an extended period of time. When I first visited the archives in 1999, I think, if memory serves me right, it struck me that while Winston Churchill and his connection with India had been covered in many books, there wasn't a single work that looked at the full panorama of that connection. After all, Churchill spent 3 years in India, 22 months spent in country in India. And that's the longest time he spent anywhere. He was at the very start of his career as an army officer, and that led to his political career. So it seemed logical to pursue this in a single panoramic perspective.
Excellent. I mean, and your book does exactly this. I mean, it looks at Churchill's relationship with India holistically, looks at it as a lifelong relationship. And I think that is very important. And of course, what it's done is it's allowed you to identify different sort of phases of engagement, or in some cases, perhaps you would argue lack of engagement with India. And I wondered if you could set the context for our listeners by taking us through those main phases that you've identified.
Thank you very much. We can think of 4 phases in which the final one is really the end phase. But the story begins with his arrival at Bombay docks. And at the moment of arrival, he dislocates his right shoulder, and that has major consequences on other things, but I won't get into that. In the 3 years he spends as a young army officer, he engages in self-study through books. He works 4 or 5 hours every afternoon, reading, making notes, contemplation. And this again is beautifully captured in several accounts. This is also the time when he uh, reflects on his father's legacy, which is very important to him, because that 6-month visit that the father paid in 1885, if memory serves me right, just before he took over as Secretary of State for India. And mind you, as Secretary of State for India, Lord Randolph actually came out with some very innovative ideas. I won't get into that, but that's a nice area, a niche for a short little study. Anyway, the problem with that period was that Churchill did not engage in dialogue with any Indians at all, British Indians or Indian Indians. By British Indians, I refer to the people who had served many years in the Indian civil service, who were professionals in other fields, who understood the land. You know, he writes to his mother saying, there is nobody to talk to, and the soldiers, the colleagues in the regiment know nothing of India, and nor do I. But he really does nothing to amend that. There is one little episode when he connects a little bit with his former principal at Harrow, uh, Mr. Weldon, who is in Kolkata working as a missionary, and he gets into a difference of views, and he actually says that it is probably better to leave the Indian in his inferior religion rather than thrust upon him the complexities of Christianity or whatever words he uses. Now, behind this is really a key element. He sees India and Indians as an inferior people. The tragedy is that this was of the Victorian age, when that was a large view taken by so many. Quite unlike the situation 100 or 150 years ago, when foreigners who came to India, including the British, were captivated by the culture, the depth, the intensity of knowledge of India, self-awareness of India. But mind you, that was the final phase of the colonial era, and Britain, to put it very gently, had sucked India dry by that time. So we were a fallen people. That's the title of a very, very interesting new book, by the way. We were a fallen people, and he simply could not see beyond what he found around him. He did not see the real India.
Okay, so that was really the sort of the first phase of his engagement with India, and you then come on to talk about other phases of engagement. But really, your argument is that his view really didn't change from that of the young subaltern. That his views were sort of shaped in this period, that he missed that opportunity to engage with India and to engage with Indians, and held to really rather stereotypical views on Indians, this contrast between the martial Muslims and Sikhs as opposed to the Hindu servants and moneylenders. And this then colours, in what way then does that
Yes,
colour
Alan,
his
you're
approach
right
going forward? What are the subsequent phases of engagement?
Alan, you put your finger on it. There was this very superficial view of the Muslims that came from the only period of maybe 3, maybe 4 weeks he spent with a Muslim regiment, the 31st Punjab, and that left him with a lifelong impression. You remember, in those days, British regiments, British soldiers were completely separated from the Indian army. Although nominally they were part of one force, they did not socialize, they did not meet, they didn't play games together. That's very important. Um, and yet, behind all this, Churchill did find a little bit of empathy. There were two interesting episodes. On his Africa safari, he understands the dilemma of the migrant labor. He says they are caught between a rock and a hard place, and he actually goes on to make a splendid prediction. I think he's the first colonial leader to visualize that the Indians have a capacity for growth, for commerce, and to self development, and they will be a force to reckon with. That is globalization before it happened. Then in 1907, there is an attempt on the life of the Secretary of State for India by a person called Madan Lal Dhingra, who, lacking real insight, ends up killing an aide of the Secretary of State, a lieutenant colonel in the army, and a bystander. And he makes a wonderful plea at his trial, talks about oppressed people and how they will fight. And Churchill said Dhingra's words will echo for the next 2,000 years. So here is a man who is able to stand aloof from the political context. But that's an episode. Then we come to the debate in Parliament over the reduction in rank and removal from the army of General Dyer. Uh, I can go into that, but in a sentence, there too he says, frightfulness is not in the British pharmacopoeia of colonial rule. So he sets his face completely against General Dyer and his actions. The hinge moment is Prince of Wales' visit to India, his 5-month visit of November 1921, October 1921 perhaps, when Gandhi launches on the day of his arrival the first Satyagraha movement. And Churchill realizes that here is a nation in ferment. And that movement dogs the shadows the Prince of Wales visit from venue to venue. It's a very complicated story, but Churchill then decides India is on a path which he has to oppose. So that's the start of his second phase of what I have called unthinking obstinacy, and it leads to his 10 years in the wilderness from 29 to 39. That's a familiar story, and I don't have to dwell on it at any length.
Okay, well, let's drill down into this question of Churchill's increasing intransigence over India, and basically, you've made the point, of course, that actually, at a time when many people were moving in the opposite direction, Churchill becomes more hardline in his opposition to Indian independence. So, the question is, what's driving that? I mean, to what extent do you think it was influenced by his views on the wider world situation and by British relative decline post-1918, post-World War One? I mean, is there a sense that Britain, in Churchill's view, now needs India more than ever for her raw materials, as a market in an age of increasing sort of national imperial competition? And of course, possibly needs the Indian army as well for controlling not just India, but also the Middle East more widely. Is that a factor, or is there more at play here?
The last element is not really in play. I think the Indian army is used a little bit in 1922 in relation to Mesopotamia, but I don't think that's a major factor. The major factor really is, as you said, at the beginning of your remarks just a moment ago, uh, the change in the world situation, the relative decline of Britain after World War II, and its need for empire. But you see, that brings us back to the same old question, which is that was Britain running the empire to suck India and the other colonies dry, which I'm afraid is what it did? The wealth of Britain was built on the backs of the colonized people across the world, and India was probably the one that was most hurt by this. But there is also a huge element of personal intransigence. Um, Catherine Mayo's book, Mother India, published in 1927, in a sense provides him with the political vocabulary, which he makes his own. And he personalizes in an extraordinary fashion his hatred for Gandhi, the language he uses, that half naked fakir business. It's one of the most repelling, one of the most obnoxious phrases that anyone has used. And I address that in the final chapter of my book, by the way, simply as a matter of trying to understand issues from a cross cultural perspective, the encounter of different cultures. But Winston Churchill, um, in a sense, his passion to protect the empire, understandable from one perspective, leads him to lose all balance and all reason. Two things. He starts telling lies, blatant lies. He talks of the Congress party, the Hindus, bringing in Janissaries from Germany to help them oppress the Muslims of India. I mean, what extraordinary figment of imagination. And I'm astonished that very few biographers have touched on this. This is not a chance remark. He said this after thought of, I think, in 1932, perhaps. And then there is this extraordinary remark that he makes, of all people, to Linlithgow, who at that point is the chairman of a select committee in Parliament. And Linlithgow says, "Why are you so adamant on India? Why don't you ease up a little bit?" He said, "If it was not for India, I would give up my political life." And he says this in writing in a communication, which I've cited as well as I'm able to cite because of the tight rules on using copyright material, which I understand, entirely legitimate. So that entire period, Churchill, in a sense, forsakes his political career for this illusion in his mind that India will help Britain save itself from the future. But Alan, just stop and think. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, he opposes the building of more capital ships for the Navy. This is again a very important act that doesn't figure very much in biographies. Why was Britain left without capital ships, or relatively speaking, because of those actions in the late 20s when he was contributory factors? And then, of course, there is the third phase when he becomes prime minister in February, joins the cabinet in September 39 and becomes a cabinet minister. But I'll leave you to pose that question, please.
Okay. Well, before I do, and before we move on to the Second World War, I'm interested in what you just said about Churchill's personality and how much of this is linked to his personality specifically and to his ambition. I mean, this is a man who, of course, prefaces his history of the Second World War with the maxim, the moral of the work: in war, resolution; in defeat, defiance; in victory, magnanimity; in peace, goodwill. And it seems to me that can be used in a way, that maxim, to sum up Churchill's approach to life. And he was someone who, if he was challenged in his views, his instinct was always to kick back, to fight back very, very hard. You see it, I think, with the suffragettes. You see it with sort of striking miners at the time of the general strike. Is this what you're also seeing with Gandhi and the Congress leaders?
Not quite. In fact, there is another maxim of his, which was also a favorite dealing with history, when he said, the further you look back, the further you can look forward. That is, you have to look back in history. Now, why did he not apply this in India or Africa or in Latin America? Why did he not delve into the cultures, the origins, the extraordinary harmony and balance that had also existed in all these cultures and all these civilizations before the predatory colonials arrived to totally destroy that equilibrium? Yes, we were always a divisive people, we were always a divided people. India was never a single political entity, so we were never a Westphalian state. But so what? In that sense, Churchill is right in comparing India to Europe, in that it was an amalgam of different states. We were that. But we also had a profound sense of Indianness. Why is it that an Indian, when he gave up his worldly life and took sannyas, he decided that at the last phase of my life, I will shed everything and I will simply go to the forest and I will walk to the great pilgrimage centers? Why were the 4 or the 12 pilgrimage centers of India located at the 4 corners of India? Literally, this was the concept of India, the Indianness of India. He simply misses that totally. But after that, yes, during World War II, he's so embittered by his hatred of Gandhi, and that hatred permeates through his life. He tells lies about India, not just in 1932, but during World War II. And, I obviously I don't want to tell the whole story of the book in one conversation, but you know that these are elements that do need much more attention than they've received.
Okay, so let's come on to Churchill's war leadership. How would you characterize his management of India during the Second World War?
He is in a state of denial. He begins by saying that the division between Hindus and Muslims is the guarantee of Britain's success in India. So divide and rule becomes literally the single trump card that he plays continually. And mind you, I'm not out simply to blame Winston Churchill. I think the Indian nationalist movement makes a number of serious blunders. Why did they have to walk out of the uh, leading the provincial governments when war broke out? If they had stayed on, they would have had a much greater standing in British eyes. Huge miscalculation. Why did Gandhiji and Nehru leave the field free for Jinnah by saying we will not cooperate? By not cooperating, you made it so easy for Jinnah to become the darling because he was going to cooperate. The Cripps mission, for example, started in a sense with a good intention, because the entry of Japan in the war, Japan on the rampage in the Pacific Ocean, the sinking of the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, the sacking of Singapore, etc. These were hugely important events for Britain and for World War II. And it was alarming in terms of where it would lead. That was a slight window during which perhaps Churchill was amenable to new thinking. He thought of flying to India, he gave up. He thought of broadcasting a message to India, he gave up on that. Because the situation changed in a matter of weeks and months, and it was seen that Japan was bogged down in Malaya and in Burma. But behind all this was the element of Winston Churchill's collaboration with Jinnah. That story is not available to us in its full colors, in its detail. We only have scraps of information. And I will jump a little bit and turn to the letter that I found in the National Archives of the 2nd January 1941. It is, I think, the first known documentary evidence of exchanges of communications between Jinnah and Churchill. It's a very banal letter in some ways because Jinnah sends to Churchill the text of his interview, the interview he gave to a British Labour Party MP, in which he inflated himself up a little bit and said 90% of Muslims are with me and I represent the voice of the Muslims of India, which was of course entirely untrue because in 37 in the provincial elections he barely got 23.5% of the reserved Muslim seats and did not win a single provincial election in the 14 provinces where elections took place. So where is all this coming from? Because clearly Churchill has been playing his cards with Jinnah. Jinnah installed himself in London at the end of 1931, at the end of the first roundtable conference, and he told people, his close associates, that the political scene has now shifted to Britain and it makes sense to be here. Jinnah had a splendid strategic comprehension. He understood the larger picture extremely well, perhaps because he was at that time and remained perhaps the underdog. So he had to be strategic. I think in contrast to the Indian national movement. Now, Churchill is also very conscious that he doesn't want to say too much about, he's very conscious of his political behavior. He refuses to meet Gandhi and sends a nice message through one of the emissaries that visits Churchill in 36. He says it would not have done to meet him at that time. Another occasion, he tells Jinnah that after inviting him to Chartwell, to his great residence, he says, let's not be seen together in London because it is not wise. So he has this sense. Clearly, there is a lot that has gone on behind the scene that is hidden away. And, Alan, that letter of 2nd January 41 is not in the archives. It was never sent to the archives by Churchill. It has survived only because Churchill, being a little too clever by half, decided to circulate it to the cabinet, and it has survived amidst the cabinet papers in the British archives. But there must be many other documents because in 46, when Churchill was out of power, Churchill's secretary sends to R.A. Butler, Rab as he was called, fellow conservative leader, the file on Churchill-Jinnah correspondence. Where is this file? It's not to be found. There are scraps of papers. And again, I go into this a little bit. All this adds up in essence, Alan, to bits of information, pieces in a jigsaw puzzle, which don't always fit together, which don't really show you the full picture, but you know that there is a story, there is a major narrative hidden away somewhere. And I think I've tried to identify that.
So you've come to believe really that Churchill's wartime administration is not just characterized by neglect of India, as is often said, because it's a neglect that's deliberately designed to favor the Muslim League.
And when the leaders of the national movement are locked up on the 8th of August 1942, locked up for 2.5 years, nearly 3 years in the case of Nehru, 2.5+ years in the case of Gandhi, when his wife dies and he undertakes a major fast, he almost dies in the process. Uh, why were those years not used to prepare for a transition of power? The transition was inevitable, just as the end of World War II was inevitable, and everyone knew this was going to happen. Then how come Churchill did nothing to prepare for that transition? Remember, in May 43, you know, Roosevelt stopped talking with Churchill about uh, self-determination for India or self-rule for India because of the harsh words in which Churchill repulsed all those efforts. But in 43, Churchill tells Phillips, who is the representative, the US representative in India, and who is brought to that meeting of between Churchill and Roosevelt, Churchill tells Phillips that a bloodbath is going to take place in India. Well, if he could foresee that, why did he do nothing to prevent it? But you know, sometimes major bits of evidence are studied away in open communications. Roosevelt's letter to Churchill of the 11th May 1942, which provokes vast anger with Churchill because Roosevelt says, unlike what you are saying, the majority of the American people believe that India has been unfair. He doesn't use the word unfair, but I'm extrapolating. He says, does not understand that Britain has not been fair to India. Then he goes on to say that if you have your face set against self rule for India, then why is it that you are prepared to give a portion of that territory away to in to partition a portion of their territory to another entity, meaning a homeland for the Muslims or Pakistan? So we now know in black and white that Churchill and Roosevelt had talked sometime in 1942 about the eventuality of a Muslim state being developed out of India. I think this is the first hard evidence which cannot be refuted because it is in a communication that Roosevelt sends to Churchill, which is part of the official documents, the published material, etc., etc. Please look up that letter. And that is when Churchill, sends out that threat in a draft not sent, where he says he threatens to resign as prime minister. I mean, what a threat to evoke in the middle of the war to the principal leader of the Allies.
So it's interesting that you bring up Roosevelt. What do you say to those who say, well, hang on, Churchill was dealing with a global war. He was wedded to a strategy that had been agreed with both the Americans and with the Soviets, with Roosevelt and Stalin, that prioritized the defeat of Germany, and therefore that meant the priority of the Battle of the Atlantic, the battle in the Mediterranean, and that therefore he had no choice but to leave the government of India to others. I think you've already touched on this, really, but what's your response to that?
Alan, that's a good question, a legitimate question. The governance of India was left to others, but he did not let the others do anything about it either. The Secretary of State for India, the Amory diary, speaks of his frustration that he was not allowed to do anything. And the Viceroy, Lilithgow, was a tall, wooden-headed man who lived up to his reputation. But listen, we've not even touched on the Bengal famine.
Well, and this
If,
does bring us to that point.
But it is relevant. It is germane.
Absolutely. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about Churchill's level of responsibility for the Bengal famine. Yes. As you know, his proponents would argue that it was caused by events outside his control, by war, by weather, and the consequent sort of constraints that imposed on shipping. His detractors have argued equally forcibly that he responded far too slowly, far too callously, and that there was a clear sort of racist overtones in the language that he was using in these discussions. I mean, how do you view that crisis, and what do you think it tells us about his wartime leadership of India?
Alan, let's put aside the words and let's look at the hard facts. The famine began in the middle of 42. Lindithgo as viceroy does not make one single visit to Bengal between the start of the famine till the time he hands over office. What kind of governance is that? Could Churchill not send out to Lindithgo action this day message, those famous red stickers of his, asking them to get off their butts and do something? That didn't happen. Uh, Churchill, first letter that Churchill sends to Roosevelt asking for food grains and shipping is in April or May 44. The British Parliament debates the famine in India for the first time through a calling attention motion, I think, in August 43. Look, of course, Churchill was busy fighting the war. Of course, he had many, many things to deal with, but he had a staff. He had a fine Lord Cherwell who was in total command of logistics and everything. Cherwell did not lift a finger to send a single extra ship to India carrying food grains. And, you know, it has been said by Madhushi Mukherjee, Baswati Mukherjee, and others that throughout this period, wheat was being exported out of India. I'm not completely sure of that. I've not used it as a main argument in my book, but I am inclined to the view that this did happen. And why is it that Churchill came out with that extraordinary comment that food grains for the Greeks who were hungry were more important than food grains for the Bengalis who were starving anyway? Look, Alan, 3 million who died of starvation. I don't think anybody in Britain should sleep peacefully if they hear about this. This happened on the watch of the British Prime Minister, who was the head of the entire administration, who had the capability and who had the tenacity to get things done. Why did he do nothing at all? I mean, look, I can get very emotional over this, so let me stop here, but say that please, please don't talk about the priorities of the war that prevented Churchill from having an iota of sympathy or understanding for the starving millions of Bengal who died. How did Churchill manage to sleep every night when he knew that this happened on his watch?
Which I think then brings us to looking at his legacy, because obviously these are, you know, this whole issue has become part of that discussion around Churchill's legacy in recent months. When Neville Chamberlain died in 1940, Churchill's predecessor as Prime Minister, Churchill gave his funeral oration, and he talked about the verdict of history not being constant. And he said, in one phase, men seem to have been right, in another, they seem to have been wrong. Then again, a few years later, when the perspective of time has lengthened, all stands in a different setting. There is a new proportion, there is another scale of values. As you look back now on your years of research on Churchill, how do you view him, and how do you think we should view him?
Think of human values which are considered so important. When Churchill goes to Stockholm to receive the Literature Nobel, and the citation speaks of the human values that feature in his writings, does he not stop to think that, by the way, I did not really respect any human values when the Bengalis were starving in 42 and 43 when I was Prime Minister? Now, How can we forget this? How can we say that this man who produced great achievement, which I do not for a minute question, also had a large dark side which has been grossly neglected. But let me put aside Churchill for a moment and speak a little bit about historians. If I'm going to speak openly, I might as well be candid. Um, Andrew Roberts, Adam Roberts, Andrew Roberts,
Andrew.
the Andrew Roberts, in his huge, important, and powerful biography of Churchill, he cites Gandhi's letter to Hitler, I think in 1940. He seizes on the opening section of that letter in which Gandhi is, what's the right word? He is kind of trying to build bridges with Hitler by saying good things about him. And he stops there, and his analysis stops there. He doesn't go on to analyze the letter in full in terms of what Gandhi actually tells Hitler in plain language. Now, tell me, are historians supposed to analyze history in that fashion? That you take an important communication, it's the only letter that Gandhi ever wrote to Hitler. You take the first paragraph or the first few sentences and you treat that as the analysis without looking to the body of the letter. Is that fairness? Is that British sense of fair play? I can think of other examples, other historians who have played that game. Now, mind you, I'm an amateur. I don't compare with the likes of the great scholars of history, but I do ask them politely. When Gandhi wrote a letter to Churchill, his first substantive letter of May 1944, when he had just been released from prison, and the Viceroy and the establishment has the temerity to say that Churchill never received the letter. The letter is sent through the Viceroy's office, and Churchill never responds to that letter, never acknowledges the letter, and very few historians are even interested in talking about it. Because in that letter, Gandhi says, "You called me a naked fakir." He says, "Let me come to you and speak to you in that capacity." And he says, "For the sake of the people of India, for the people of your country, for the people of the world, aren't there things we should do together?" It is a very conciliatory letter. And here is this great politician of whom people said he was forgiving and magnanimous towards those that he disliked. He treats Gandhi as if he didn't exist. I mean, how can you, sir, as a historian, accept this?
Well, I think that question is an excellent note to end our sort of formal discussion on and to throw this open to our wider online audience. And so we are now going to go into our live Q&A session. But Kishan, thank you very much for sharing those thoughts so frankly and powerfully with us.
Thank you, Alan. I look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Well, hello again, everyone. You're probably wondering why it is that Kishan and I are now suddenly appearing in different garb. This is because, as those of you who listened to the live session will recall, we did encounter some technical difficulties when Kishan was dialing in from Istanbul. So we decided to re-record the Q&A session, and I'm now going to put to Kishan the questions that you posted on that day a couple of weeks ago. So Kishan, if you're ready, let me start.
Please.
Okay, I wanted just to start with a question of my own, but one which has come up in discussion with others on this subject. And that is the extent to which you believe Churchill was typical or exceptional of his time. Of course, Churchill's defenders tend to argue that here was a man who was born in the Victorian era, whose views were formed fighting for Queen and country in the 1890s, and of course, in that respect, was typical of his time. But that, of course, that view, of course, has been challenged, most notably by Richard Toye in his book Churchill's Empire, and he argues that, of course, that by the 1930s, many of Churchill's views were exceptional, even for the time, and he was already out of touch with mainstream political thinking in Britain. And I just thought it'd be interesting just to start this Q&A session by getting your take on that specific question. I know you've touched on it already in our debate, but to what extent do you think Churchill was typical? To what extent exceptional?
Alan, I have to begin by saying that I don't know enough about Britain and British history to make any authoritative comment on that. But it seems to me that, yes, this excuse that Churchill embodied Victorian thinking, it's a little bit of an overdrawn, maybe a shop-worn kind of an excuse. But the reality is that Churchill juggled with facts to suit his perception of reality. And he did this all the time. And this really baffles me. Very few biographers, historians have gone into the complete lies that Churchill invented about India. I'll give you an example. In 1932, he said, I think it was a speech, where he said that German janissaries, that's a delightful word, I believe it comes from Turkish personal guards, who were actually very loyal to their sultan. So I think calling borrowed soldiers janissaries is a bit of a stretch, but so what? That German janissaries would come to India and would help the Hindu Congress Party to put down the Muslims. Now, I mean, this was such a bizarre invention. To imagine that Germans would be interested in India sufficiently first to come to India, or that Indians would ever think of using Germans or XYZ to put down their own people. I mean, Churchill could not get his mind around a simple fact that the Indian national movement was not a religion-based movement, and he constantly, continually gave religious color to the leaders. Way as late as 1947, 46, when the provisional government was to take power, he called Jawaharlal Nehru a caste Hindu. Now, it's a meaningless term. What is a caste Hindu? A Hindu who believes in his caste? Well, I suppose everybody believes in their own environment, their community, their people. And in India, these were castes. But Nehru, Gandhi, Sardar Patel, nobody could remotely call them anti-Muslim at any point of their lives. And, the catalogue of Churchill's lies during World War II is a fairly long one. In relation to India, I'm only talking about India. In relation to India is a long one, but I won't get into that now. I think they are covered fairly exhaustively in my book. But coming back to your question, no, I think it was simply on Churchill's part a denial of the marge of history. And for a man who constantly claimed that by looking backwards you could see forwards, he did a lousy job of looking forward. And I'll end with one simple point. After 1942, the conference with Roosevelt and Churchill's refusal to budge on the question of self-governance for India, Roosevelt more or less gave up. But during that meeting of July 1943, which took place in the United States, he asked, I think it was Phillips, he asked him, or he asked one of his aides to raise the India issue with Winston Churchill. And Churchill made a very interesting remark, a prophetic remark, that the carnage that would follow between as and when division of India, British India took place, would be a bloodbath. I think that was the word he used. Well, if he saw all this in 1943, why did he do nothing at all to prevent the bloodbath? I mean, these are simple but hard questions that I regret to say many biographers and historians have not bothered about. I don't know for what reason. I think it is simply that Churchill has been given a vast amount of leeway, a vast amount of indulgence, if I may use that word, in order to have behaved in a manner that was completely beyond the pale when it came to dealing with India. I've written about this in my book, so I shouldn't labor that point.
Well, you've also set us up perfectly for the first one of the questions that has come in from the online audience. And this is a question from Naomi Caligaro. She actually has 3 questions, but we'll take them one at a time. And her first question, I think, picks up exactly from what you've just said. And she asks, who do you consider responsible and to what degree for the rushed through bloodbath that occurred in India in 1947?
Oh, that's a very complicated question. I would be loath to pin blame to any one set of individuals. We may even ask if anyone could have prepared for partition. I mean, I honestly don't know. I am not an expert on the subject. It requires people with much greater knowledge to examine that. But it stands to reason that if you knew that a division of British India was to take place, and we have evidence of this from Roosevelt's letter of 11th April 1942, in which he says that you are going to separate a part of this entity, referring to British India. So this was already on the cards. Why could preparation not have begun for that? And the actual boundary lines that were drawn, the famous Radcliffe Award, it was all completed in a matter of weeks in 1947. People were given no notice. People didn't know whether they were coming or going, whether they would be in what would become Pakistan or what would become independent India. People could not make their plans. Surely there were ways in which things could have been organized much, much better. But in truth, I don't know.
And that brings us on perhaps to some of the individual relationships. Naomi asks also specifically about the relationship between Churchill and Leo Amery, his Secretary of State for India, and of course a man whom Churchill had known for most of his professional life as a politician. I know it is a relationship that you write quite extensively about within the book, but do you want to comment on that relationship?
Not really, in the sense that, as you know, it was a complicated relationship. We have a brilliant record of what Amery thought day to day through his diary. Amery was one of these rare individuals who kept virtually a daily diary. And at Churchill Archives, I had the privilege of scanning through it literally page by page, which is something that is no longer possible. I understand everything is now digitized, but be as it may. It was obviously a very complicated relationship. Emery was one person who criticized Churchill to his face in the cabinet. They had major showdowns. Various others have written about it in their own diaries, Churchill's private secretary and others. But at the end of the day, I mean, Leo Emery was a good man, a nice man. But, you know, there is one interesting point in the Leo Emery diary, which I noticed. It's like the dog that didn't bark. There is very little mention of Jinnah. And I wondered why. And I guess, again, this is one of those leaps of hypothesis that I offer. It is because Emery knew about the extensive sub-rosa connection between Churchill and Jinnah. I understand, I believe this was carried out through the secret services of the two countries, the Intelligence Bureau in India and its British counterpart, but it may well have been that it was exclusively handled only by the British Secret Service. But clearly, there were strong connections and communications that went to and fro between them. I know you are not likely to agree with me because there is no evidence. The evidence is in the fact that there was a degree of familiarity between them. There was a degree of, I would even say, tutor-pupil relationship, which is reflected in the message, the verbal message that Churchill gave to Mountbatten when Mountbatten came to see him in London at his bedside, because Churchill was unwell at that time. And Mountbatten said, you know, I don't know how to deal with Jinnah, because every time we bring an issue almost to the point of a decision, he goes back and everything has to start again. And Churchill gave a verbal message. And that is recorded in many, many accounts, including the fine book by Stanley Walpert. That kind of a message could only be given by somebody who had a commanding authority over the other individual. That's my surmise, for what it's worth.
So Naomi's third question relates to another Indian figure, and I suspect it ties into what you talk about in the book and what I think you did mention in our discussion, which is Churchill's lack of engagement with Indian intellectual life and political life. But she asks, could you please comment on any connection that may have existed between Churchill and Rabindranath Tagore, and if no connection existed, any view that one may have had of the other?
No connection existed, because in the days when Rabindranath Tagore was active, I think Churchill, and that's in relation to the early part of the 20th century, Winston Churchill was not a person who had any particular India connections. And I doubt very much if Rabindranath Tagore might have said or written anything about Winston Churchill. At least I've not come across anything, but maybe I don't know enough about the subject. But mentioning this, talking of this, I am struck by the fact that there was no connection established or no effort at a connection between Jawaharlal Nehru and Churchill. Unlike Gandhi, who tried very hard in the 30s to reach out to Churchill, he even tried in the 40s. He sent an emissary, a British lady who was some kind of a clergy person to meet Leo Emery, because she knew she couldn't, because Gandhiji knew that he couldn't reach out to Churchill directly. And Emery had 2 meetings with her, with this lady, but they were completely wishy-washy. And I don't think Emery was interested in pursuing, using her as an indirect communication route with Gandhi. Nehru did nothing of this sort. I think it was perhaps a mistake on his part. it was perhaps an act of, what should I say, disdain. And Nehru was aristocratic in some of his dealings, in some of his attitudes. And then when they finally did meet, in May 1949, they got along extremely well. But even at that time, while Churchill said some outrageously flattering things to Nehru, to his face, and in a communication that he sent to him in 1955, when he said, when he called him the light of Asia, and of course, Nehru loved that kind of praise, anyone would. Privately, he told President Truman and the French Prime Minister, when they met in Bermuda, that he felt that the two entities of former British India would fail miserably, and I forget the exact word he used, in the absence of guidance from Europe. I mean, after all these years, Churchill simply did not understand that the world did not really need the guidance of the white states, the white countries, or the European powers to run their affairs. Churchill would be astonished if he were alive today, or if we were to visit our planet, at the way in which different countries have thrived and prospered in their own way. But that was Churchill. So I don't think it was Churchill's old thinking. It was just Churchill's refusal to deal with facts as he found them. And this is a very curious trait in a man who is otherwise a great man, a man of enormous achievement, which cannot be denied.
So this has led to Chris Murphy making a comment and asking a question. And his comment, of course, is that the British used the divide and conquer as a successful strategy in India. His question is, the British realized that most of the intelligentsia were Brahmins. In 1919, an anti-Brahmin pro-British party called the Justice Party was established. Did Churchill directly help the Justice Party?
Chris Murthy is a very old friend of mine. And I'm afraid he sticks to certain ideas of his own. One of them is his touching faith in the belief that most intellectuals were Brahmin. This is utter and complete nonsense. I mean, you cannot place a caste division on intellectual ability in the same way that in Britain, you cannot go through the aristocracy and say that the intelligence of people or their ability to achieve things is measured by their aristocratic status or lack of status of that nature. This is, people are people. Intellectuals are to be found everywhere. And it has nothing to do with either caste or the class in which you are born or your wealth or whatever else. I mean, this is so self-evident. It's hardly worth talking about.
So then this leads us on perhaps to a final question, which I think pulls a number of threads together. And this is a question from Eugene McConler, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And Eugene's comment that is really that as an arch believer in the British Empire, that Churchill presumably would have opposed independence to any part of it. So to what extent is there a difference in his approach to India compared to other parts of the empire? I suppose in a way it's linking back to that very first question. You know, what is different, what is exceptional about Churchill's opposition to Indian independence?
Well, I think that's you have presented that question in a particularly sharp and pertinent manner. What is exceptional about Churchill's actions vis-a-vis India? There was a degree of personal hatred, personal antagonism, and personal rejection that he employed vis-a-vis a whole range of leaders of the Indian national movement, starting with Gandhi. He virtually personified in Gandhi all the things he hated about India and Hindus. Now, where did that anger towards Hindus come from? I honestly cannot give a simple, clear answer. Perhaps it connects with the 3 or 4 weeks he spent with an Indian regiment, the 31st Punjab, which was an infantry regiment, which eventually went to Pakistan when partition took place, which was largely composed of Muslim soldiers. That was Churchill's only exposure to the Indian army. Because, I think we went into this at some point, that the army in India was really composed of 2 elements: the British Army, which controlled the artillery and the major firepower, so to speak, and the Indian Army, which was also officered by British officers, but they were permanently seconded to those regiments, those battalions. They spoke the language. It could be Punjabi, it could be Rajasthani, it could be Bengali, it could be Hindustani, whatever it was. And Churchill somehow kind of was enamored of everything that he saw, the elan, the commitment, the loyalty of those soldiers. Now, it's really an extraordinary event in that when Brigadier Sir Bindon Blood sent him to that regiment, to that battalion, to replace, to fill vacancies, because many officers were away from the regiment and they needed some officers in their place. He could have just as well have sent him to another kind of regiment composed of Rajputs, or composed of Madrasis, or people from UP or from Maharashtra or wherever. But that particular accidental event ingrained in his mind an extraordinary admiration for Muslim soldiers. Forward to 1942, he once told Roosevelt that 75% of the Indian army, the fighting elements of the Indian army, were Muslim. And this was absolute and utter nonsense. And somebody on his staff realized that this was not the case. They checked, they got the figures from New Delhi, and a correction was sent to President Roosevelt saying that 32% of the Indian army was Muslim and 45% were Hindu. But even that figure is fudged, because another 10% were Gorkhas, and Gorkhas are also Hindu. So, I mean, I'm getting away from the question. But if we ask, would Churchill have behaved in the same way vis-a-vis other countries that fought for their independence or self-government? I think in a way he did, because Churchill was Prime Minister during the period of the Mau Mau uprising in East Africa, which was put down with a degree of ferocity, with a degree of ruthlessness, which is another slur on Britain's record in Africa. The same is true of Britain's actions on the Malay Peninsula and the manner in which it dealt with the Malay movement for independence. So, in a sense, repression of independence movements was standard procedure. But when it came to India, there was a degree of personal hatred, animosity, anger. I mean, look at the manner in which Churchill dealt with Gandhi. All of Gandhi's efforts, he said nice things about Gandhi to Gandhi's emissaries, but he did not lift a finger to help the depressed classes of India, or to advance their cause, or to advance the cause of economic development of India, of which he said many things. You know, Alan, I would invite your attention to the instructions that Churchill gave to Wavell when Wavell took over as Viceroy in October 1943. And Churchill told Wavell, his instructions consisted of 3 points. One, work for communal harmony in India. I mean, this is rich coming from a man who did everything he could in order to foster communal divisions in India. And he's now telling Wavell to work for communal harmony. Second point, he said, work to abolish the caste system in India. Well, I wish we knew the magic formula through which the caste system could be abolished. Even today, we have not managed to abolish the caste system. But the caste system is increasingly less relevant, and perhaps I would even say irrelevant in most situations. And third, he said, work for the prosperity of India. Now, is there one action that we can attribute to Winston Churchill and say, this is what he initiated or tried to do as Prime Minister to remove poverty in India or to advance India's economic development? He did absolutely nothing of the sort.
Okay, well, Kishan, thank you so much for sparing so much time to present to us and also to come back and answer those questions so fully. It's been a real pleasure reconnecting with you. And I want to remind our audience that, of course, we've only scratched the surface of this huge subject, and that you do have a book, Churchill and India, Manipulation or Betrayal, which will allow them to follow up in more detail. And of course, you've also very kindly contributed a chapter to the Cambridge University Press companion to Winston Churchill, which I'm editing. So, Kishan, thank you so much. And for the moment, we will leave it there, but I'm sure that the discussion and the debate will go on.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm deeply obliged to you for having given me this opportunity to have enabled me to use the platform of Churchill College and Churchill Archives to reach out to a larger audience. Do please read the book. I am hoping that somebody will review it in a British publication, because it surely cannot be that Britain is so wedded to a sentimental, rose-tinted view of Winston Churchill that they are unable to face other perspectives which bring a different reality about this very complicated, but this great man who has such achievements to his credit, but whose life and whose actions vis-a-vis India are a dark spot that has not been explored sufficiently. I hope my book, with all its limitations, serves as the first of many other works that should follow, that look at Churchill's legacy as seen by different people from different continents, including those that were Britain's colonies. Thank you very much, Alan. I'm obliged to you and to Churchill College and Archives for all the support that you have given me. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.